which has sponsored this facilitated community of practice along with NOAA and the Island Institute. I would ask if during the summary session you have ideas or suggestions, you put them in the chat. Also, this session is being recorded. You will have opportunities also to turn on your video and microphone if you want to provide input when asked. Now, let me first say I want to thank everyone for the effort you have spent over the last month to bring forward your critical thinking in regards to how to respond to the challenge of ensuring that equity, diversity, and social justice becomes the fabric to any adaptive response to the impacts from a changing climate. And I also want to thank our facilitators, Susie Mosier, Meredith Hare in the public health track, and Rachel Jacobson, Anna Morandi, and Nathan Robbins for a healthy economy, Don Murray and David O'Leary with transportation, and Ned Gardner and Nicole Kane in regards to housing. Also, if you didn't get a chance to hear from our excellent presentations on equity and justice, the recordings are linked to your living agenda, so you can go back and listen to them again. And let me remind you, on Thursday, day after tomorrow, our final panel session on financing and funding responses to a changing climate will be from noon to 1:30. So now let me turn it over to Krista Daniels to introduce the day to you.
Great. Thank you, Michael. So we have a short time again, of course, and so we're going to try to fit a lot in today's session. And basically, this is a chance where all the breakout group discussions and the folks participating in them are all together. So if you were in housing or economy or public health or transportation, we're all in the same room now. So it's very exciting. And so what we're going to be doing today is doing basically a report out and kind of a summary of the themes and patterns that we saw come out in the discussion groups. And we'll remind you at the end of this session today, but of course, all these discussions and these summaries, this is what's building our roadmap for climate action in New England. So you'll see this again. We just don't have it compiled yet. We just have the different summaries right now. But what our idea is that after this week, we're going to be working on compiling that report, and then it will be available to everybody. So we'll end up sending a link to the report for everyone that attended. And then after you get a chance to look at it, we will also have it on the website. So that will happen in a few weeks after this Thursday. And so with that, I don't want to waste too much time because we have a lot to cover. What we're basically going to do next is we're going to go through, and first we're going to have each of the facilitators, the lead facilitators, basically talk about the different pieces of the discussion and some of the main points. So we'll go through, and we'll go through in the same order. So Susie Moser will start, say, for public health, and she'll talk about the vision and what she saw as some of the priorities under what the vision would look like. And then from Susie, we'll go to the economy group, and that will be Rachel Jacobson. And then from there, we'll talk with Dawn from transportation, and then finally Ned in housing, in that order. And then after we go through the vision, then we're going to look at the roadblocks. After we look at the roadblocks, we're going to look at some of the solutions. We're going to look at some of the equity supports in particular. And then Michael and I will go over a little bit of some of the things we saw across all groups. And again, ask for folks to weigh in on some of the questions we had for people based on some of the things we saw. So with that, and we're going to spend 15 minutes on each section. So it's not a lot of time, but we wanted to make sure you had a chance to see this and respond to it. So vision is where we're going to start. And again, like I said, we'll start with Susie first with public health. And when she's done, we'll keep going. And the idea here is to kind of look at kind of the main points. And it's okay if things are repeated. And it's okay if we see contradictions, of course, we want to notice that as well. But if things are repeated in different groups, that's great, because obviously there's, something there in terms of something we should prioritize and focus on. So with that, I will turn it over to Susie. And again, this is a discussion. It's not really a presentation per se. So she's going to kind of talk about some of the things she saw in terms of what would this vision look like for a climate resilient future for public health in our area. So with that, Susie, take it away.
Thanks, Krista, and thanks, Michael, and thanks to everyone who contributed to our two groups. I want to start out by simply acknowledging that between the two groups, we had one person of color. So what you're going to hear is very likely to be the result of, lots of privilege and limited perspective. And I think it's going to be great to hear how we can fill in with other people's perspective. So let me just sort of give you the very top lines of what we visioned a healthy, resilient community to look like. And we did vision a community as opposed to, a country or a state or whatever. It encompassed elements of both the physical structure as well as the people. Of the things and the stuff, if you will, as much as of the activities and the people. And so to me, that brings it really alive. So integrated, diverse neighborhoods, resilient infrastructure and housing that's accessible to all, not just to the privileged. Ample and accessible green space everywhere across the community, not just in some neighborhoods. Overall, a sort of safety, security, and well-being culture, which has more to do with the attitude, obviously. We certainly wanted a lot of good schools in that community, clean water, soil, air, local waste handling, if that isn't already there, because we don't start from a blank slate. We start with legacies, a lot of effort put into cleaning those up and restoring those places. People caring for people. That was a really big theme. And you'll hear that again and again from this group. There was a lot of effort put into sort of social capital, human capital building, but people checking on people, and good jobs, fair taxation, affordable, accessible healthcare, again, for everyone, not just, for the few. Very active people too, and both active in a physical sense, but also in a civic cultural sense, very active. People who really understand climate change and resilience, what it takes to create resilience in their individual personal lives, in their neighborhoods, in the community as a whole. And because that is, that's not going to come about in just out of the blue sky, whatever. We also saw a very big importance for supportive policy environments, both at the local, state, and federal level, and committed, sustained political leadership on making those things happen. So I'll stop there because all the details would take up the rest of the 15 minutes. So I'll hand it over to other groups.
Great, thanks, Susie. And we knew that Rachel Jacobson, she had another commitment and was going to be just a couple minutes late. So maybe, I don't see her here yet. Maybe Dawn, if it's okay, we can go to you to talk a little bit about transportation and some of the key insights you saw in terms of what that vision would look like.
Great. And like Susie, I want to acknowledge my whole group and thank you, Krista and Michael. Our group combined three main principles. That was, our vision was shared transportation, convenient, and people-centered. So those were our three big points, similar to Susie's group. We had sustainability was a vision, a goal that functions on a regular basis, incorporating alternative fuels and is affordable, with a long-term goal of divesting from fossil fuel. There was resilience, meaning, the transportation works in all weather, all conditions, capacity to run 365 days a year, and encouraging a neighborhood style accessibility. So, for example, essential services can be available in a reasonable time frame. Constant innovation was part of our vision. With routes that connected to hubs throughout a larger, maybe state area. It was easy and exciting to encourage ridership, incorporating technologies like broadband, 21st century technology with like apps and people who use those apps. Multimodal, an option for passengers' travel choice, so an infrastructure that encourages different modes like biking, walking, scootering. And accessibility, safe, clean, non-polluting transit with those services, and members in the community are encouraged or maybe even paid to be involved in change making. Everyone involved in connecting the community, even the private sector. We also have nuanced funding as our vision. So these transportation services would be funded as an essential service. So there's long-term planning, values, transportation funding in these unprecedented times. So maybe a dedicated excise tax for a period of time to specifically fund equitable transportation efforts, and environmental justice that was informing all the decision making. In terms of, we had a lot of discussion about inclusivity, safety, the essential service, that's available in a reasonable time frame, the routes considering user needs, affordability, and enhanced effort needed to connect people to where they need to go, places and things, and leadership, community transportation leaders championing these concepts in action. That's all.
That's all. Great. Thank you, Dawn. And as Michael said, as we're going through these, if you have something that you might want to add, for example, something you think that you want to supplement to what is being presented, just let us know. And then again, like I said, there'll be time for discussion at the end. But you can either, I believe you can raise your hand or throw it in the chat too, because we'll definitely see that and be able to call on you.
Krista, do they have access to our summary docs, or should I put some of the bullets in the chat?
They have access. So the summary docs are all in the, I think, let me see. You might put them in for now and we'll make sure we get a link to every participant so that they can, sometimes it's hard to find things in a Google Drive without a direct link. So.
And I'd love my group to chime in at any place and time.
That's right. I see it coming in. Thank you, Ned. You threw yours in there. That's great. Perfect. And, for some folks, you might want to just hear the rest of them and then, it might be time that you have an epiphany or you have something that you want to add. So Rachel, thank you for being able to fit this in. I know you had a problem with double bookings, so we tried to figure this out. So we've asked, as you know, Susie presented a little bit about the vision that came out of the public health group. Dawn just finished with a quick summary of the vision that came out of the transportation group. And now we're hoping you can give the vision that came out of the local economy and green workforce development group.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm sorry I missed that those first 2 or 1.5 vision share outs. And yeah, just for context, for those who don't know, the Local Solutions Conference, which is now the Facilitated Community of Practice, is actually part of a group of 6 regional climate adaptation fora that take place around the country. It used to be in the even years. Now we're delayed by a year. So the one that I actually just came from, through the magic of Zoom, was the Carolinas Climate Resilience Conference, which is another one of those conferences. So it's been a whirlwind day, and thanks for having me. So if I do repeat something that was said by the other groups, I don't think I'll apologize for that. I'll just say that I imagine that there are lots of things shared between these visions. So the first theme that emerged in across our subgroups on economy is around new business and industry practices and outcomes. And the vision for this is an interconnected, sustainable business ecosystem that supports ecological, economic, and community health. And a way to sort of envision this is to think about industry and manufacturing and energy production that are so clean that people want them in their backyards, kind of turning that old idea of NIMBYism on its head. That we are embracing new technologies and at the same time enhancing ecosystem services. So we are specifically embracing new technologies that allow us to enhance ecosystem services. And one example of this can be seen in the Maine economic development strategy. So and now this is actually just a direct quote from that strategy: forest products as an example of Maine's key position in developing solutions to meet global demand, with innovative building materials that sequester carbon and make buildings more energy efficient. So leveraging Maine's forest resources and forest-based economy for more sustainable product manufacturing. And another example is just envisioning a living and breathing built environment where, one participant wrote, even highways don't need to be permanent. So this kind of sense of fluidity around this environment that we're envisioning for ourselves, which again is all driven by new business and industry practices and outcomes. The next theme is around a prepared and inclusive workforce. And this is, of course, all driven through investments in people that really allow this green economy and this green economy vision to flourish. And in this vision of a prepared and inclusive workforce, it's taking what we have, using an abundance mindset. So that includes taking the existing skills that the existing workforce has and applying them to this new green economy and green workforce. And it also assumes equitable access to workforce training so that there's diversity in the workforce, as well as respect and advancement opportunities for workers at all levels. So rather than some sort of social hierarchy based on completion of specific types of education, this vision is about an inclusive workforce that really respects people wherever they are in their contributions to that workforce and the economy. In the vision, that the economy subgroups came up with, really central to it is engaged and supportive youth. And youth came up so many times across our groups and across our conversations. Engaged and supported youth, what that looks like is youth that are inspired to enter the green workforce and that are also supported on that journey. And that young people, especially people who were born or grew up in the local community, remain there and take on leadership roles in the community. I think I heard Dawn sharing out a little bit on this in her vision statement, but just adding to it, this idea of a high quality of life, a holistic and comprehensive high quality of life, is a huge part of this vision. It includes living wages for everyone. It includes high functioning and clean transportation systems, affordable housing, and really a respect for people as whole people who don't just want to contribute to the economy, but also just want to grow, that have complex needs. And so I think this is so important to think about, that the vision for our green economy is not just about a functioning economy. It's about putting the people in that economy first and really seeing them as whole people. So the goal is to invest in the people, not the goods or services. And of course, central to that is that there's this high quality of life is for everyone. And that includes having equal opportunity to be in that economy in the way that you so choose. This vision includes inclusive and democratic decision making, and that looks like a really high level of civic and economic engagement. And though that civic and economic engagement leads to opportunities for shared wealth building. And I'll talk about shared wealth building more when we talk about solutions and strategies. But in the vision, of course, it's just there. There's inclusive decision making, there's democratic decision making, and there is shared wealth building. That means that there's transparency in decision making at all stages. It means that there's a high level of outreach and education, and that there's really purposeful networking and relationship and trust building across all sectors and scales of society. I'm sure I heard Don mention this as well: sufficient and creative finance and investment. And just one example that I'll share here is the idea of using nature-based solutions to funnel money and resources locally. So it's this vision of, just a plethora of nature-based solutions having been implemented, and those things sort of working. The gears are turning and it's producing resources that then go back into those communities that they can reinvest. This vision includes a sort of a cultural shift where we have confronted our risks. So there is a recognition of needing to retreat from high risk areas. There's a more prudent distribution of economic assets that acknowledges risk in different places. And there's holistic assessment of who owns risk, how is that risk distributed or redistributed to be more equitable, and really a strong consideration of future populations. And then finally, and this again is a theme, well, these all themes go through all of our sections, but I think this one is so important, is a connected and inclusive culture. That in this vision, there is an inclusive, open, and welcoming society. There's willingness to learn from past mistakes. There's a desire to make informed decisions. People are approaching their work and their needs from a perspective of abundance. There's respect for community traditions and practices. There are frameworks that acknowledge grief and trauma. And industries are designed around shared benefits as opposed to being designed around cultural norms of colonization and war. And then decision making is proactive rather than reactive. And this actual articulation was shared a couple of times in the Jamboards, which is basically summarized as being the change rather than letting the change happen to us. So this proactive, connected, and inclusive culture.
Great. Thank you, Rachel. So I'm going to transition quickly to Ned, just so he has a chance to give the housing vision. And then after that, when we get into roadblocks, there's going to be time during that time for folks to throw in the chat questions that we have. So Ned, can you give us a quick summary? Well, not quick, but a summary of what happened in terms of vision for housing, the housing group.
Absolutely. It's my pleasure. And acknowledging how Susie kicked things off. And I want to acknowledge I'm on ancestral land of the Lumbee in the coast of North Carolina right now. And I think we and our team recognized very early on that we each carry an individual perspective, and that my attempt to summarize is, I know, going to be insufficient to capture the diversity of opinions. So I would really encourage people to enter into the chat their own perspectives on what this vision is. I wrote up a very brief description of one of the plenary speakers we had on housing, because she was so inspiring. I want you all to go check her out. So feel free to check out that brief write-up I did. And I would encourage you to look at the recording, if Antioch makes it available, of the description of Push Buffalo. Just a super inspiring ground up effort to take community back from degraded economic conditions. But I do think time is limited, and I'll just touch on 5 things. And these are broadly overlapping with what's been said. We talked about, in housing, livable design, and one of our participants simply said, build it the way you'd want to live in it. I think that's a very good principle that transcends and brings in a lot of synthetic information about how we'd like to build our society in an equitable way. And so we touched on many aspects of comfort and changing the energy systems that we rely on to make that livable condition. And I think there's real design effort needed to reconcile some of the challenges we have. And I think we had a very, in our group, we had architects, planners, engineers, builders, carpenters, and scientists from different backgrounds. So we spent some time thinking a little bit about design. In our notes, you can see a little bit about what we were thinking. And we did talk, another broad theme we talked about was transforming the economy. And you've all touched on that. I think Rachel's comments really did justice to that. And I'm going to move on to the idea of neighborhoods. And this is echoing a lot of what was said. So I will add to the points about livability, transportation systems, creating a sense of place, making communities walkable, having community solar and community energy systems that support the people who live there, is an important sense of ownership and place that can be built by, co-owning things. The infrastructure that we rely on for our living. And so comprehensive planning and cultivating a sense of community, which can complement individualism. We talked about some of the paradigms, and I'll get into this in the next section, that people have about their worldview and dealing with that explicitly, but building ways of supporting a sense of community in a neighborhood. And finally, the last broad category we touched on was policy, that policy should reflect a close working relationship with people in each community. And it was very strongly borne out in our plenaries that is essential. When it doesn't happen, we do not get a clear buy-in and sense of priority from the people who live in a place. And there are major pitfalls which we exposed in plenary. So the idea of intergenerational stability, training the workforce, and maximizing nature-based solutions, all of those themes came out very clearly with a lot of detail. I'm going to, I can't share my screen, Krista. I was going to show a cool picture. I'll save it for later maybe, but we had some examples of community housing projects in Burlington, Vermont, and a co-op in, I think, Oakland, where cooperative housing is a great way to enact this vision, but maybe we can come to that later. And with that, keeping it as brief as I could, I will turn it back to you, Krista.
Sure. Thank you, Ned. Thank you so much. I know we have a lot to cover. And so a few things, we're going to get into some of the roadblocks that we encountered. And because we're limited on time, if everybody could keep it to, 2.5 minutes for this section, just so we can also allow the crowd time to write in the chat if they have questions specifically about a barrier they may have heard. So in this section, as you're listening to some of the barriers that are listed, the roadblocks that are listed in the groups that need to be addressed, if you have a question about one of those barriers, it'd be great for you to throw that in the chat for us to take a look at as you're listening. So with that, I'll turn it back to Susie to hear about some of the roadblocks that came up in terms of public health.
Great, thank you. Well, they almost feel like the black hole around all the vision, the opposite of everything what everyone just said. So I guess I just put a link to our summary where I have the whole extensive list of all the usual suspect barriers in there, but I want to highlight the ones that showed up again and again, and maybe most prominently, and they had to do with worldviews and values and attitudes and feelings. So I just want to talk about those. They included things like a me culture, bigotry, conspiracy, scarcity mindsets, the systemic racism and disadvantaging of people, intentional or unintentional discrimination, just simply being unconscious of our biases, NIMBY attitudes, having just simply no vision, people who are just, look like this into every day. That sort of thing really prevents us to even open up the possibilities of what could be done. And then, things like lack of compassion and empathy, impatience, fear of change, exhaustion and burnout. I think, Rachel, you mentioned the whole issue of the whole people in the workforce. Well, some of us who work in this workforce are on the leading edge of the burnout crisis, as some of you who know me on that score know. So anyway, the point is, we just don't have the right minds and hearts in many ways to begin that. And last bit I want to mention there is just think about, when was the last time you changed a habit? Like, how long ago was that? And did you succeed? And how hard was it? Well, if we want people to change what they eat, how they get around, how they even approach their work, how we do or not, bring everybody to the table. I mean, those are habits that, yes, we can grow conscious of them, and they are incredibly difficult to change. And, I think for that, it just needs leadership, and we don't have it in so many places. So I'll stop there. The list is much longer, but those were the big offenders.
Great, thanks, Susie. And so we'll just stick with the order we just had. So I'll pass it on to Dawn, if that's okay with you, Dawn. If you could just in 2.5 minutes, give a quick summary of some of the roadblocks you guys experienced.
All right, our group came up with funding as a major roadblock, social cultural divisions, expertise, misconception of needs, critical infrastructure, and time. So those were the main ones. I will just say a few sentences about each. Funding, we were looking at capacity for and more clarity around grant funding, specific staffing for advancing transportation, raising the minimum wage, supporting and truly representing middle and lower class. Social cultural divisions, we were looking at urban and rural differences in values, awareness and access, and considering things like migration, gentrification, and privilege. Trust in government systems, so that's dominant single-use car culture, and social discrimination like voter suppression and racism, and long work days in terms of commuting. And then the expertise piece was traditional ideas of expertise may leave out important ideas, change makers. Systems of hierarchy and valuing traditional experience may evade authentic stakeholder processes. So we really wanted to make sure, that the voices of the people who were using these services were the leading voices. The misconception of needs was the systems of privilege that allow for certain needs to be centered and met with funding opportunities, recognizing there's a small pipeline of communication from grassroots to local, state, and national officials. And that critical infrastructure was updated. We wanted it updated for new technology and hazard preparation. And then the time, authentic and effective implementation. Leaders and project managers are stretched too thin to consider extra components like equity.
Great, thank you, Dawn.
And I want to call
yeah.
out Jess Hench for really helping with this. So Jess, you can, thank you.
Thank you, Jess. Before I go to Rachel, Sharon, I noticed you had a comment in here, and I'm going to ask the facilitators to maybe pay close attention to that when we get into the solutions. So when we come to the next section and we're starting to talk about solutions, hopefully when you're looking at your solutions, you can see the comment that Sharon made. So, if you can make the connections with vulnerable populations and how the solutions might specifically meet their needs. And then we'll also have a conversation more on that in terms of the equity section. So with that, I'll hand it over to Rachel for a quick, like I said, 2-minute summary of roadblocks that your group reported out on.
Sure. So yeah, I mean, a lot of them were the same, although it's interesting. Just reflecting that, Susie, you talked a lot about individual roadblocks or roadblocks that individuals experience. Dawn, you got into some more structural roadblocks, and I would say ours are a mix of both, but probably a little bit more on the structural side. So we had funding and capacity. We had existing power structures and entities in power, fear of change, cultural disparities, lack of leadership, communication and engagement, and then not enough time. So like Dawn, I'll say a few brief words about each of them, but you can see there is a lot of overlap. There's not enough money. Existing money isn't going to the communities that need it most, and most of the money is disaster recovery money, which isn't sufficient or structured appropriately to meet climate resilience needs. An interesting note from one of our subgroups is that some communities are not applying for funding because there isn't enough to go around and they don't want to compete with their neighbors. Existing power structures, I think a couple things: legal rules, tax laws, entrenched industry interests and assets. For example, redevelopment authorities that have unlimited power, and then economic feedback loops like gentrification. These are all examples of existing power structures that are inhibiting progress, or entities in power that perhaps need to share their power or be removed from power. People just don't want to have challenging conversations, and they can feel overwhelmed by the scale at which change is needed. And Susie, you spoke a lot to that in the barriers that you shared. Cultural disparities, really similar to what you shared, Dawn. Rural-urban divide came up in our groups, class divides, cultural segregation between races, divisions based on technology access, people who are from a community versus people who are quote unquote transplants to a community. And like specifically that these disparities in culture create roadblocks to relationship building. And relationship building and trust building came up over and over in our conversations as, a fundamental building block to progress. And that is eroded by, no, it's not eroded by, but it is challenged by these cultural disparities, which of course are magnified by segregation. And the values that are held by people in a dominant culture of a place don't often lend themselves to pursuing equity. So things like white supremacy culture, not valuing the entire ecosystem, and not valuing marginalized people. Lack of leadership, it sounds like that came up in other groups. The people at the top don't often have the desire to center equity, and then there isn't often a critical mass of people or momentum to move the work forward from the ground up. So if you don't have leadership and you don't have the resources needed at the ground level to create that momentum, then that is a huge barrier to change. And communication and engagement, I know that we'll get into that much more deeply. Basically, there's not enough, and it's ineffective. With time, I just want to, this operates on a few different levels. One is that we are not doing enough preparedness for the more damaging climate impacts that are on the horizon. And for other really big shifts like climate migration. We are at best responding to disasters. And then the other way that time plays in is a lot of people who need to be engaged in this work in order for it to be more equitable and just and inclusive don't have the time to engage in it. And so that is a problem with a serious feedback loop. So yeah, not enough time.
No, not even enough time for us to go through all the conversations in a quick summary, it seems. Ned, do you have, can you go over quickly some of the roadblocks your group talked about? And it's okay to repeat some of the ones that were repeated because I think it shows, consistency and something that's happening across all topics.
Yes, and we have a tremendous amount of alignment with what's been said so far. So the topics I'm going to address are design, institutional and structural problems, land use, cultural attitudes, and personal issues. So from a design point of view, it's important that processes should better reflect equity. For example, if you're solving a flooding problem, don't create an accessibility problem. And we could go on about design and who it serves and who it doesn't. From institutional and structural perspectives, we discussed the legacies of race, class, toxins, affordability, accountability, and policy. So legacies in our culture are everywhere. And we need to understand what those are in order to address them. We talked quite a bit about economics of ownership, say, versus rentership, and the practices that tend to support some groups of people, but not others, as well as some ways of using energy versus others. I mean, we all have lived in that apartment where it was just easier to open the window and leave the heat running because you had no control over the darn radiator in college or wherever it was, or New York City. Sometimes it's just not feasible for people through the systems that are in place to make a good energy decision right now. Power. So this came up in each of the other conversations, but it's in the hands of financiers, developers, highly educated people, lawyers, wealthy neighborhoods, and housing itself is seen as a private resource in our culture. So just acknowledging that that can be a barrier in its own right. We discussed land use, zoning, planning, and the maladaptation that comes with the way land is used, acquired, developed, and abandoned, which prevents proactive and inclusive, equitable, adaptive decision-making. Talked about cultural attitudes that are actually embedded in our architecture. You can see our cultural attitudes when you walk down the street, but you can also experience the policy, the environmental outcomes of short-term thinking and myopia and the lack of accountability. We talked quite a bit about how in our culture, we often value decisions more than relationships. So the attitude that engaging in dialogue is not really the work came up in a couple of different conversations. Whereas that is the connective tissue that can also create opportunity. We talked, as Susie led off with, we talked about worldviews. And for example, the attitude that let's get right to fixing things really misses the point of first reconciling what our history is, who we are, how we've gotten here. We talked a little bit, say, if you live in New Hampshire, on every license plate, it says live free or die. And where's the communitarian New England spirit in that? So our minds are preconditioned and continually conditioned and reinforced in certain ways. And we need to see that in order to address it. And then there's a pragmatic, personal set of barriers around people's capacity, whether they know where to go for resources and whatnot. And I'd like to briefly, very briefly, Krista, don't freak out, share my screen and just point out that in regenerative design, it is barriers actually that help us to focus on how to reconcile. So if we know what we want, what our vision is, coming up against a barrier can lead us to a higher level of thinking, how to overcome. And I just dropping this in here briefly to point out that there is this whole area of regenerative design where we can use the barriers as ways of focusing our attention on what to do next.
Perfect. Great visual, Ned. I really liked it. Thank you. So for this next part, like I said, we're going to get into some of the solutions. Some of the facilitators might have a slide to share. And if they don't, that's okay. We can describe it. But here's where we're going to talk about some of the strategies and recommendations that came across in their group. And we're going to start with Susie. And like I said, this is a great section and we can continue it in the equity section. In the places where we can tie some of our obviously recommendations or strategies based on the question that Sharon had asked earlier and others I've heard from in the chat, is how some of the solutions can specifically target or benefit vulnerable populations and issues of equity that we've been talking about. So that'd be great. And so with that, I'll pass it off to Susie. start into the more positive side, I would say. Just getting away from the black hole, as we put it.
Well, or as Rachel put it, this is just the depressing part, but cathartic. So let me just quickly say, oftentimes when I think about these issues and where the issues are, I sort of have this lens of a collective impact framework. And the most important, deepest lever of change has to do with mindset and all those paradigms and ways in which we think. And from that springs the relationships that we need to build and the power relationships between us as we negotiate these things. And as we change that, we then can affect the structural, the policies, the resource flows, and the behaviors. And so to me, this is sort of the mindset and why my own mindset or framework, and why I emphasize the mindset piece, not to forget all the others that everyone mentioned. So let me very quickly share this from our group. Can you see that? Or is it still in? It's trying to come into.
You can see it.
Yeah, it's small, but we can see it. Oh, there we go.
Good enough. Okay, so I in this laid to put together our solutions with the roadblocks, and I didn't put sort of individual arrows, but there's really a direct relationship between the solutions and where on what parts of the roadblocks we need to get to so that we affect get to the vision. And Sharon was in our group, and so the emphasis in much of what we're proposing is sort of like the notion of, or the guiding principle of, put the people who need the services most, who've been most neglected and didn't have access to all these good things before, put them at the center. That is the priority. But having said that, different groups in the community or in society will need different communication or education, right? So it's not just, we're just blasting only one particular group, but say the education of white people might have to do around, racism and systemic racism, and to some extent climate change. Whereas, for other groups, it might be, what are the specific things I can do, right? And we're thinking of education for all ages in very hands-on way, not an abstract sort of, intangible way, but to really get people to know what it is they can do to build their own and their households' resilience, communication in multiple languages, before, during, after crises, at all levels, from all sources. So we're envisioning a massive campaign actually around that. The politics, that just, is one of those cross-cutting things, but it was really important. We need champions for this kind of work. And a lot of it has to do with addressing the structural issues like campaign financing, voting, redistricting, those sorts of things. So it's not just the very local politics, although, it's like fractals. They are at every level where that needs to be addressed. Healthcare and services, that goes from access through universal healthcare all the way to having very locally specific resilience hubs. We had a very strong emphasis on mental health services and providing that in a culturally appropriate way, and for people of low income and including undocumented community members. So that's where centering the most vulnerable comes right through. On the infrastructure and building side, I mean, that's just echoing everything we've heard from the other groups. But one of the things maybe I want to point out is the mandate to build back better, as opposed to basically tying the carrot of money to the need to actually build back better, stronger. Greening the community, that to us was a whole community effort, both in the what to plant, where to plant, how to maintain it over time, and including how to finance it. So that was, public, private, civic sort of activity. A lot of emphasis on the social and civic life. And all I want to say there is, we had so many celebrations and so many community gardens and so much activity that was sort of, to bring a community alive, sort of from a this active civic life kind of perspective. That was a really strong emphasis on, and not just during crisis or for the purpose of climate change. That's what you do. Resilience is what you have every day, right? And community life is what you have every day. I won't emphasize more on the economy. We have a whole group on that. The environmental piece, a lot of that was in the restoration of remaking the community. And then lots of cross-cutting solution things like, learning what works by having ongoing evaluation, building and training people to be leaders in that community, coordinating across levels of governance and things like that. So I'll leave it there, but I think we're actually going to echo a lot of what you're saying in the other group. So thank you, everyone, and I'll stop sharing so the next person can go.
Perfect. Thank you, Susie. So with that, I'll go again in the old order. So Dawn, if you could go over some of the solutions that you saw. Yep, see it. We see your screen now. Perfect.
Great. So we put, some barriers on the far left, and then we divided our solutions into local, state, federal, and cultural solutions. So we kind of had this 4-pronged approach, and hopefully you can read our ideas for each level. Since this will be shared with you, maybe I won't go into the details, but I think one of the most important ones is this cultural solution. And I'll just say, this is where we wanted community-driven engagement and taking down the patriarchy, allowing for better, more creative cross-sector communication and freedom, equity considerations, finding a cause, reducing, even, looking really outside the limits of our current structure, maybe reducing the work week, reducing a workload. But the taking down the patriarchy is where we focused a lot of our conversation, really looking at the systemic issues and how we could potentially uproot those. And Krista, I just don't think I need to go into detail of every single box, but that's.
No, great. Thank you. We appreciate this. I'm just going to give yep. Perfect. All right. With that, Rachel, if you're ready and willing to kind of go over a few of your solutions, perfect. Thank you.
Yes, I am excited to go over these solutions. Just finding my notes. Okay. So building local wealth. I mean, this was really about local ownership of assets like land and power generation. Creating financing mechanisms like loan pools and microloans that can really get local businesses and projects moving faster and in a more equitable way. And these kind of measures have to be paired with free and affordable education and training or retraining programs, as well as commitments to hire local labor for projects. So those are just like some of the things that go into building local wealth. Okay, I mean, like we can't talk about funding enough, but I feel like I don't need to go into depth there. We all know that that is a solution. Partnerships, again, I want to highlight just like this idea of building trust, that it's not enough to just work across sectors or across scales. It's not enough to just like reach across the aisle. In order to have lasting change, we have to really build trust. And I want to highlight one idea, which was, I think I might need to sneeze. Okay, maybe not. So, we have a lot of like big environmental organizations, the big greens, so to speak, thinking about how do we get organizations like that have a lot of power and a lot of resources to partner with local community-based organizations. So these kind of partnerships that maybe haven't happened very often, but could be really fruitful. More and better planning. Again, I don't think that we need to go into this, but just a couple of key things here are like more transparent processes, more effective engagement, a longer length of time for planning processes to actually build in those principles for quality and equitable planning. The one I really want to go into is this next one on seeking knowledge from all. in our subgroup particularly, but then I was really pleased to see this in the notes from the other subgroups in the economy group, was this idea that we have to engage and seek knowledge from people on the ground to inform what happens at higher levels of governance. Integrating local knowledge, lived experience into planning and assessment processes, not just relying on top-down science, peer-reviewed literature. That's not to say that those things aren't important, but there's so much knowledge that needs to be brought from the ground up in order to, and that is so much of a part of not just the climate resilience solutions, but it is so much a part of the justice and equity solutions. People who are affected by climate impacts need to be the ones providing that knowledge about their lived experience, and they must be paid for their time and effort. And it sounds really simple, but we're not doing it right now, which is why it's still on the solutions list. And really, when it's affected individuals and community stories and narratives that are the ones driving change, this can create that shift in power and resources to the people that need it most that we've been talking about in these structural barriers. So that is not to say that we don't also need, again, like peer-reviewed literature and top-down science. We also need, better training and education for climate service providers so that they can provide needed assistance to communities. Those things are really important, but I do think that those are more known solutions, whereas this idea of seeking knowledge from the ground up is a little less mainstream than it definitely needs to be. For leadership, I again just want to highlight that in our groups, in our subgroups, people talked a lot about specifically leadership from youth and from grassroots level advocacy, but again, in particular, youth and young people, and making sure that they're inspired and encouraged and supported in taking on leadership roles. And then finally, I think that accountability is something that often gets left out of the conversation. Like, what are the systems that are going to hold us, as we work to change our individual values and thus our cultural and societal values? What are the systems that are going to hold us accountable to living out those values and putting them into practice and moving past words? Things like recognizing past wrongs and respecting trauma, like we need to be held accountable for that. And that really is so important to systemically addressing and overcoming the bias and injustice that's baked into our system right now.
Great, thank you, Rachel. And just quickly before we go on to Ned, I love that you guys brought up the point about actually valuing and even paying folks in terms of their planning, consulting, and knowledge transfer. It was interesting, as Susie knows, in our public health group, we had Medford Resilience Hub and KLM speaking a little bit about that and talking about how at a minimum, every project we're working on should have 30% of the budget based on equity. So paying folks to come to the table, paying to have a portion of your project actually to see your equity goals come to fruition. And that was at the minimum was 30%. And we all know how that's not, we're not seeing that now in most of these projects, that there's actual a line item of a percentage that's specifically focused on equity issues, no matter where the project is based. But so let me go off to Ned to hear some of the solutions that came out of housing.
Okay, great. Well, I'll kick off by pointing out Project Push Buffalo once again, because they, in their projects where they're doing community redevelopment and using funds from state and municipal sources in Buffalo, they actually build not just job training. I think we all know the pitfalls of job training if it doesn't lead to a job, but they require that construction jobs be offered to local residents. So local residents decide what to do, they make sure it gets done, and they hire themselves to do it. And we saw this as a best practice that we thought was worth emulating and reflecting back to the group, that there are successful examples. And they also pay people to come to the meetings where they might stretch out a decision process longer than a city council would want, but darn it, it is something that is invested in and co-owned, co-produced by the community. So again, an excellent plenary example to pull from for our group. We really valued that. The solutions around new values, and I resonate with Susie's point that it's value systems. It's what we believe that is most important, because that is going to be reflected in every decision, every motivated reasoning, every conversation starter and finisher. And Running Grass shared some of the work of Mabel Wilson, who and he reflected that in the plenary he gave last week. So I'm not going to recap it, except to say that that we do have examples of how our history will repeat itself if we do not overcome these values. And so I'm a broken record, I guess. I've mentioned this in every of my sections here. The design practices, particularly regenerative design, seem to, and permaculture, for example, came up many times, but we touched on it in different ways, around the living wage, around hiring locally, about integrating LEED with energy systems and biomimicry and biophilic design. So we were focused on housing, and so these themes may have emerged in slightly different ways than they did for others. And so that, biomimicry, I didn't hear mentioned by others, and it's something that, it gave us green rooftops. It gives us the idea of closed energy systems where you generate your energy locally and so forth. We had some discussion around the value of new construction versus retrofit and design. Certainly retrofit and design is important. Providing insulated, comfortable housing is very important, and where we have a large investment, sometimes it's easier and better just to tear it down and start new. And that does cost more, but that may be a fact to face in terms of some of the solutions being just better when you do that. We talked about policy, that there are levers in place right now. There are financial systems in place right now. There is a public housing system, and there are technical assistance programs that can be leveraged and improved. We talked about some examples there in zoning and the ways that localities can work. I actually have 2 pages of notes on that. I won't go into that too much because I think your brain will fry. We talked about supporting sovereignty of people. So this is a different way of saying something I heard you say, Rachel. By building financial independence for people and in communities through and we focused on recognizing community champions. So something one member in the group that I was in said many times was, find the people who are doing things locally already, surface what they're doing and support it locally. So that's an example of supporting sovereignty, finding those leaders, champions, giving them the tools that can help them do their work. And again, actually I have a ton of notes on that, but I'm going to continue on to finance and funding. So Rachel touched on this, but it did come up in our conversation. We talked about the role of private, municipal, federal, local funds. So obviously we have some alignment there with you. Building intentional and equitable community through clear-eyed planning. And we talked about this we incorporated transportation, addressing people's needs. So housing in its own right is hearkening back to some of the vision, making sure that schools, shopping, community services are accessible to people near where they live. And our existing way of developing land is very much not aligned with this principle right now in general. And so where it is happening, we should recognize and promote. This is a little bit of a repeat of supporting sovereignty, but localizing leadership in frontline communities. So, I'm a lumper. I probably should have lumped this with supporting sovereignty. However, we do have a number of links in the chat here. I'll just drop a couple things in the chat from that example. And I'll end, the last point I want to make was about accountability. So Rachel said that as well. I think we all recognize how important and valuable it is to have accountability so that people are able to reflect back to the community what they've actually done, not just their intentions. And I do want to show those pictures I wanted to show earlier very quickly. This won't take too long. Okay, we talked about some of us are building nerds and we wanted to talk about that, so we did. But also there are examples. So here's the example from the East Bay in California of a real estate cooperative, powerful model worth looking at. East Bay Permanent Real Estate Cooperative. And then here's an example from Burlington, Vermont of co-housing, multi-generational co-housing, where people are intentionally living in a way that gives them access to community, to services, affordability, and so forth. So I think there are some great examples to build on, and our group reflected that back. So thank you, Krista, back to you.
Thank you, Ned. So now in terms of equity, I'm hoping we can do this like as a round robin and really get into what were the key equity issues that were heard, obviously, and then how are they being addressed already? Are there any good points to bring up about how they're being addressed effectively, or where they still obviously need to be addressed? And what were the key needs for support when looking at these types of issues? So I'll pass it on to Susie to start.
Great, thank you. Well, gosh, how to summarize that? It was the thread through everything. You know, I want to maybe first start with the issue of legacies. Is so much of the systemic disadvantaging that has happened has put, you know, a particular set of people in the most vulnerable places, the most exposed places, leaves them with the least resources, leaves them with the dirtiest air, with the dirtiest water, soil, and so on, you know, the leakiest windows, the, you know, all of those things that we just mentioned, right? And furthest from any green space and furthest from any public transportation. So, you know, I think that's the starting condition. And so much of what, you know, needed to happen is to remedy and restore and repair and actually provide reparations in our discussion. So much of that conversation was about, you know, the way to health is to address those systemic issues, which is why we ended up talking so much about the mindsets that determine the power dynamics that determine the structural, you know, flow of resources and so on and so forth. But, you know, as I said before in my opening remarks, so much of the conversation was among us white people. So, you know, very limited perspective. And so the needs for amongst our set of professionals anyway, had to do with how do you even start this conversation? Started among your peers, but also with your superiors. How do you start it in particularly in comfortable white communities, you know, that are all talk and no walk on these issues? You know, yes to diversity, but no to affordable housing, that sort of thing, right? The not wanting to have any of this in your backyard. And how do you maintain these conversations? So many of these changes will take time. And, you know, people mentioned the trust building that takes time. And my God, do people not have the patience for those sorts of things? And the, you know, and in many ways, not even ill-intended, it's just, you know, I got to go to work, right? So to have the staying power to be with these conversations and go through the discomfort and the difficulty of these conversations and, you know, stay until it is changed, that is actually a big commitment, and a lot of people don't know how to actually make that happen. So lots of details on that, but you know, that was sort of a big headline. Another piece was around how to center equity and justice as values or lived practice in the work and the visions that we have. It's one thing to talk about it, but how do you get it into your job description so you have the official permission to do and focus on these things? How do you get it into the organizational mission? You know, how do you make it, you know, how do you turn the vision into concrete terms? So that's, you know, a lot of the sort of the how-to of actually changing it. And I think I want to, maybe as a partial answer, at least to that, point to a lot of the things you all have just pointed out, which is you stay in the conversation, you draw on the wealth of expertise and the enthusiasm and energy of the people in the community to get to the right answers, as opposed to you having to figure it all out. Much more difficult when that community as a starting place is much more white and unwilling to have these conversations. So we're going a little bit in circles there. And then the last bit was around keeping equity front and center in behavior and policy changes. You know, once you get to that level of actually putting something in plans, in policy, in writing, all of a sudden people get really challenged around that and you know, don't want to make those kinds of commitments. So it's actually quite a leap to go from talk to institutionalizing that. And again, a whole number of different questions around that. So I'll leave it there.
Great, thank you, Susie. Dawn?
Our key equity issues were to, one, reframe expertise. So looking at the individuals and groups with the lived experience, those are the experts. So that was our key. Thinking in systems, so highlighting co-benefits to solutions and undergoing root cause analysis was key for us, looking at the root cause. Redefining existing power structures to uplift the voices of the underrepresented and marginalized groups by community members in decision making. Funds for inequity, so as seen with COVID, prioritize basic human services. And transparency of information, considering creative ways to share accessible and authentic information.
Thank you, Dawn.
Thanks.
Rachel.
Yeah, I just want to say I really appreciate, Susie, the way that you were able to articulate how these issues flow into one another and can, you know, both help or hinder, you know, getting to the progress that we need. So I'm not going to be able to do that as articulately because I really just listed out the issues. But, you know, I just want to share my appreciation. So I think, you know, really at the top, the thing that people talked about most was how do we equitably distribute costs and benefits? There's so many things that we need in order to be able to do that. You know, and Susie really articulately described what inequitable distribution of costs looks like in terms of how people then are living. But yeah, this question of how do we assess where costs and benefits of incentives and projects will accrue? You know, like right now, the ways that we have for assessing those things, all they're doing is entrenching existing inequities. And that includes, you know, in what projects get approved, in what projects get funded, in where, you know, in where resources flow. And it also works in the opposite direction, which is that many projects are working to increase the resilience of existing high value assets that benefit people who already have the resources to deal with climate impacts. So ultimately, we need a serious restructuring of the economy. But for now, what we need as a first step is different ways of assessing how those costs and benefits are accruing and really interrogate where they're flowing right now. And then it's been said many times in a couple of different sections, but you know, this is kind of the follow-on from, you know, seeking knowledge from all, finding and redefining expertise, and both Susie and Dawn just spoke to that as well. We have to really avoid creating or reinforcing a hierarchy of knowledges if we want to be able to overcome this unhelpful and exclusionary biases that we hold. We need to expand our concept of what's successful, and just bring in a lot of perspectives that are not even being asked about, you know, let alone actually acted upon. And then we've talked a lot about this, but working on ourselves, and how working on ourselves can be really uncomfortable. And so, this was also said by Susie and Dawn, I think, but, so we need spaces where people can do that work, where they can do that work, be held accountable to that work, and acknowledge the fact that it's going to continue to be uncomfortable, and yet we still have to work through it. Looking at every juncture of a project or a planning process and asking ourselves what decisions are being made here and who is making those decisions. And that is, one of the really fundamental needs underlying increasing equity in the processes that get us to the adaptation work that we're doing. We talked a lot in our subgroup, and I saw that it came up in some of the other subgroups as well, about shared best practices and metrics of success, that people talked about needing a more widespread understanding of the methods and strategies that they can use to keep justice and equity centered in every stage of processes and projects, and that we need metrics for measuring the success of this work. And we talked about the need for those metrics to be locally defined, but to also have some shared elements across larger scales so that we can compare and learn from one another. And I think that part of that is recognizing what best practices and metrics of success tacitly already exist, and what needs to be created new, because there is so much that's happening. And this is a comment that I put in the chat, I think in response to something Ned said, which is, in agreement to something Ned said, which is that there's so much work that does center justice and equity that's happening locally on the ground. And if we want to scale that, the best thing we can do is look to that to see how is that work being conducted, and how are those local organizations and local communities measuring success, and how can that inform the way that we think about success at a larger scale. We need a critical mass of people that are doing this work. There are so many people that haven't even been introduced to these concepts yet. We've talked a lot about the cultural change that's needed, the individual changes in values, and I think all of that is, as Susie so articulately described, like really fundamental to how we make change. But the reality is that if there's only a small subset of the population that's being reached with those messages, that's being invited in to do that cultural change, that's a real problem. So how do we get a critical mass? Capacity and funding, I'll leave that there. But then finally, like a vision. And I so appreciate that this process has started out with vision building, because people talked a lot about how important it is to have a vision for what just and equitable outcomes for community resilience building look like. That having that vision, and also creating opportunities to articulate small wins along the way, that is a really important method for attracting more people into that journey. And that can also overcome some of the barriers that we talked about before, about feeling burnt out, feeling like there's enough time for this work. We need transformative change, but showing incremental progress is a really important way to bring people along. And the more people that we bring along, the greater our chances of success.
Thank you, Rachel. Ned, thoughts from housing to add, and then after you're done, I'm going to turn it over to Michael.
Okay. Well, it's interesting. I really see a consistency in the way we're kind of categorizing things, but that we have some different lenses. So from a synthesis point of view, it's really interesting, for example, to think about, I wrote down long-term engagement. You can't make friends when you need them. And the need for, so I think that was Susie's, if not first point, one of her big ones was that really need to commit over a long period of time to build relationships. And Rachel gave some really specific ways we can do that. And I'm while that's difficult, I acknowledge that, frankly, I think that's kind of one of the exciting things about what we're doing. So we're looking for opportunities where we haven't before, maybe, to build relationships. The idea of transparency. What we focused on, where maybe the economics group was looking at the flow of money, we were looking at the flow of decisions. Who's making decisions? How are they making decisions? And by looking at that question, can we reevaluate how to derive power from a whole community perspective? And once again, we have just a really powerful example of how to do that with Project Push. So I really want to hold them up one more time. Communication and engagement. One team member pointed out, just use straightforward language. All of us, I think most people probably on this webinar study communication and engagement on some level, but storytelling and strategies that work. But having clear messages and simple ways of talking so that everyone feels included in what you're discussing is a really important aspect of socializing ideas that more than one person, in our discussions wanted to emphasize. I categorize the idea of self and team evaluation, and I heard this from the other facilitators as well. Reaching deep for structural change through deep listening and critical evaluation of power dynamics, so that we are all being conscious of our own, where we sit, where we're positioned, who we're talking to, who's not in the room. And also, even if there are people in the room with different perspectives, don't assume that they represent more perspectives than their own. And it's important to continue to try to incorporate and understand the impacts of decisions on people who may not be well represented, period. We talked a lot about valuing lived experiences. I put that in my notes as sort of in contrast to technocracy or ways of making, and Rachel, you talked about ways of making decisions. And so very resonant there. We talked about mainstreaming lessons, and frankly, I was thinking a lot about my colleagues in adaptation who've reminded me about the importance of this. But several people brought up the need, Krista, to mainstream, and Michael, take the lessons from this community of practice and take successful examples and help a broader community see and understand them. So I think this synthesis effort is very important. My last point is about accessibility for older adults, for people with disabilities, and that there are real barriers that we may not feel if we're not experiencing them. And so that was a last point I wanted to put on the table because I hadn't heard it. So thank you, Krista, and Michael, back to you.
Sure. Thanks, Ned. And thank you all. This has been very informative and educational for me. I'd put in the chat because Rachel really got me to thinking about sort of how do we get the group to think about the next stage. It's sort of like, and Rachel talked about setting up or institutionalize accountability, and also how to determine what would be appropriate metrics or indicators one would want to look at in planning and implementation to try to gain some idea of progress forward is bringing equity, diversity, justice into the fabric of our planning and implementation. So I'm opening this up to anybody and everybody to either use the chat or just to step in. And sir, this is new work, and it's young work, but it's important work. And it'd be good to give people an idea of how to start thinking about this, how to start thinking about evaluating progress along these lines that we've been talking about for the last 6 weeks. So I just opened this up to the group.
Michael, I just put in the chat the link to a toolbox, which is all about measuring progress and success on adaptation and resilience building. And in that, we focus on sort of 6 key dimensions of adaptation success: the process that you set up, what goes into decision makings, the actions that are actually being taken, the capacity that you're building in the community or in the whatever the entity is to make those kinds of choices, and the work that is done to overcome barriers, and then the ultimate outcomes. And what we found is that essentially, you know, in typical evaluation of efforts, we only focus on either the actions or on processes, but not on the whole, on all the 6 dimensions. But if you really want to capture whether something is working and is moving forward, oftentimes so invisible, right? This is not what we're talking about with equity, is not ribbon cutting opportunity. This is often the hidden quiet work in the, you know, in community rooms or centers, whatever. And so in order for you to really capture whether any of the investment in adaptation actually is leading to progress, you need to look at all 6 dimensions. And in that, we have tip sheets and facilitation tools to get the right stakeholders around the table, to make sure that you're paying attention to accessibility and paying people and language, and, you know, that you're looking at you know, who the targets are for the actions, who benefits from that, good governance principles. I mean, lots of the kinds of things that set you up to create a different decision-making environment to move things in a better direction. So anyway, and there are also sample indicators in there. It's not the full list. This is not meant to give you, here's the ready-made list. It's meant to stimulate creative thinking in the community, but then let the community define what is meaningful to them, because that's ultimately what's going to, you know, help to make to move it forward there. Anyway, I just want to point people to that resource.
Yeah, and I also want to point out in the note, Lindsay Radcliffe gave us a link to Government Alliance on Race and Equity, and they have toolkits and resources too. So people should pay attention to that. So let me turn this back over to Krista, because we're at time.
Yep.
And let her just talk about what's coming up next.
Yeah, let me talk about what's coming up next. And then really quickly, since we promised to try to keep you guys always to just an hour and a half, but there'll be more opportunity to talk after this is over, like I said. So a couple things. One, something to start thinking about is this deeper dive into some of these topic areas. And some of these will end up being discussed at various other organizations we partner with and work with. You know, ASAP might be doing something on one of these in terms of a deeper dive, and we're going to try to gather you around that, or Climate Access, or whichever group is involved. But some of the things Michael and I saw, besides just the indicators, things to think about, is this long-term planning. So there's this almost like a dichotomy of how do we get over this me, and get to here now us, something Susie and I have worked on in the past. So thinking about what's happening now and how it's us, not just me, but at the same time, not just thinking about the now, but planning for the future, right? So planning for the impacts that we know are coming and are going to be very different than what we're even planning for now. So there's might be room for a deeper dive among folks to really go into that part of it. There's the indicator issue. There's the authentic engagement and empowerment of all stakeholders. How are we going to achieve that? We saw participatory democracy across every group, talking about true, authentic participation. And what does that look like on the ground? So there's all these ideas that came across. And so what's going to happen next, as Michael said, is we're going to have the financing mechanisms and funding panel on Thursday. We have Joyce Coffey, Bola Kushimo, and Deb Markowitz that are going to be talking on that panel about various tools they've been using and seeing successful at the local level. And then after that, we're going to put out a survey. So 2 things are going to happen. One, you're going to have a survey. And in that survey, we're going to also poll everybody about, if you wanted to continue this conversation, would it be geographically bound, or would it be topic? And then we're going to open it up to you to choose and look at some of the topics that came up across all conversations to maybe take a deeper dive. So you're going to be able to weigh in there and add other. And then in the meantime, we're going to be probably talking to a lot of the facilitators that have been involved to just gain more insight from what we've read. and we're going to put this all into a roadmap. So you'll be able to look at the links and see everything written now, but we're also going to make a cohesive document that has everything. So there'll be appendixes with all the information, but then there'll be a nice summary and trying to put it all together. And like I said, we're going to try to get that out in the next few weeks. We have graduation coming at Antioch, so we might be a little delayed having to work on that right now, but that will be out there for everybody, and we'll make sure you all receive an email from us with all the information so you can link back. So am I missing anything else, Michael, before Thursday to bring up? I think I've covered some of it. We're so excited to have had everybody participate in this. We really have a wealth of information to move forward on what we're going to do a deeper dive on. I mean, this has been amazing.
Right. Yeah, I would just add that, we're recording this session and we will attach this to the agenda. It's still a living document. So as soon as we can get that up and attached, you can, if you want to review, because I'm going to watch this again because there's a lot of information that I need to focus on it going through this that was helpful. So that's it.
I just want to say thank you to your university and for doing this. I think it was a wonderful program, and it really set off some wonderful ideas. And I'm looking forward to seeing what happens in the future. So thanks again for it all.
We appreciate that. Thank you. And again, I just want to also thank Noah and the Island Institute, which helped sponsor this so that we could put this on for all of you. So I want to thank them again. So I think it's about time to leave the meeting. So everyone, thank you very much.
Thanks, everyone.